Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Beatriz. I work at the Malta Financial Services Authority, more specifically at the Supervisory ICT Risk and Cybersecurity function within the authority. My stream specifically deals with policy and regulation management, and more specifically, one of my main deliverables of my stream is the delivery of the national implementation of this upcoming regulation known as the Digital Operational Resilience Act, or just simply DORA. So DORA sets a number of key requirements for financial entities within the financial services sector. It has five main pillars, and we're going to touch upon them briefly today. And it aims at, as I've said, increase the digital operational resilience of entities within scope. So the regulation has just been published in the EU official journal, I believe around 2 weeks ago on the 16th of January, and it's going to have a 2-year implementation period and be therefore fully applicable by January 2025. So the idea behind these videocasts, behind organizing these videocasts, is to prepare license holders for this new upcoming regulation. So the idea is not just to go over the main requirements, just to go over the main pillars of the regulation. The idea is to hear you and what you want to hear about. So basically, we fully encourage you to send an email to the email address that you can see on screen right now. And what we would like to hear from you more specifically is there any particular question that you have about the regulation? Is there any specific topic that you have some questions about that you would like to cover, that we like us to cover in this upcoming series of video casts? Is there something that your organization or financial entity is specifically concerned about? Maybe there are some difficulties within the implementation of the DORA regulation or something that you do not fully understand, and that is okay. Even us as the regulators, there are things that are still unclear to us. So the aim is to prepare our license holders and authorized persons for what is to come, and for us to understand what you as an authorized person needs. So please, we fully encourage you to get in contact with us regarding this. And lastly, as a way of introduction, if you have any questions, there is a chance that your question is featured within the next episode. So once again, do not hesitate to ask. That's enough for me, and as a way of introduction, I would like to introduce our guest of honor here today, Alan DeCellis, who is the head of the Supervisory ICT Risk and Cybersecurity. So, hi, Alan. Good
Hi,
morning,
Beatrice.
almost good afternoon now. I wanted for you to introduce yourself a little bit more about you, your experience, but more importantly, to introduce the MFSA, introduce our function, and what do we do.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for that introduction. I have now been with the Malta Financial Services Authority for a bit less than 3 years now. I started as a deputy head in 2020, and eventually I moved to head in 2021. Prior to that, my main professional experience was mainly with the government IT agency, and I moved quite a number of roles there, from ICT operations and service management, also to ICT project management, mostly related to national identity management systems. And my latest roles were on information security. I pursued undergrad and postgrad studies in this field, and I did also a number of different certifications, and I'm still studying up till now. But more on my bio, it's available on the MFSA website. Perhaps it would be good to also introduce a bit the function. So, the Supervisory ICT Risk and Cybersecurity function has been established in February 2020. Its establishment was part of the MFSA Vision for 2021, and it was a direct deliverable of the MFSA Strategic Plan 2019-2021. The function is a cross-sectoral one, and it supervises authorized persons on their digital operation resilience, and we will speak more on this digital operation resilience as we go along. The MFSA is the single regulator of financial services in Malta. And thus, as a function, given that we are cross-sectoral, we typically supervise and oversee financial entities which are regulated by the authority. And these would go from banks, financial institutions, organizations working in the insurance and pensions business, and also investments. This is essentially as broad as we go. There is no standard setup in how you should supervise financial entities, in that not in every jurisdiction the respective national competent authority implemented supervision in this way through a dedicated single function. What do we supervise exactly? So typically, in very simple terms, we supervise ICT governance, entities, ICT strategies, their governance framework, how much their board is involved, in ICT. We also supervise the ICT risk management framework, maybe as a very high level topic, which then has, of course, different ramifications along the organization. But we also supervise the entity's management of ICT third-party risk. And as you will see, under DORA, this is going to be a prominent area. The involvement of the function is through the whole supervisory life cycle of financial entities. So it starts from authorizations, and we continue providing our activities along the supervisory life cycle, including, for example, in supervisory engagements. The function has substantially increased last year. We now have people who are dedicated to authorizations. We have other people who are dedicated to conducting the supervisory engagements, which may range from on-site inspections to more off-site work and reviews which are more of a thematic nature. We have also established a stream within the function which is currently working on Tiber, the Maltese Tiber implementation. More on that as we go along. We have a stream which is dedicated to the major ICT-related incident reporting process, which we have established last year. And that's, in a very brief nutshell, what the function is currently doing.
Thank you, Alan, so much for the overview. And it's nice that you touched upon the establishment of the function in 2020 and the MFSA strategic vision. And this ties in with what I wanted to talk about and what I wanted to focus now before going to the requirements of the regulation and the regulation per se. So what I wanted to do is to set the scenes on risks, and I think on ICT and cyber risks more specifically. And I think that the establishment of our function 3 years ago now, I had to check the calendar because we just changed from 2022 to 2023. So 3 years ago, and it just well exemplifies how, at least for me, in my opinion, ICT risks have increased, they have evolved, and they have changed in their nature. And at the backdrop of these new ICT risks, we also need new control measures. We need new arrangements. And I think that the establishment of our function well exemplifies that. So more on risks. From your experience, I wanted to ask you, do you think, especially in the financial services sector, ICT and cyber risks, they have increased? If they have changed in number, in nature, what do you think?
So first of all, I would really like to start by expressing my deep respect to all the people who work in this field. Okay, this is a 24/7 related field. I think that the energy that these people put in their work is something which is commendable, and I think it is also underappreciated. Of course, until an ICT-related incident happens. Of course, ICT-related risks have increased, and of course, they have evolved. I will not be going into too much detail about threats. There are organizations like ENISA, for example, and reputable vendors who provide reports on the threat landscape year after year on a regular basis. However, the Digital Operation Resilience Act, alongside other legislation, like for example NIS2, like for example CER, these are clear testaments of that. Prior to that, along the years, we have seen also an increase in the number of publications in this area. So you have publications related to principles and guidelines published by European supervisory authorities, the European Central Bank, the European Systemic Risk Board. You have publications from the Financial Stability Board as well, the International Monetary Fund, the Bank of International Settlements, G7, IOSCO, the Bank of England, and the story goes. We as an authority have seen this coming as well, and that is why in 2020 we published the MFSA guidelines on ICT and security risk management, as well as outsourcing arrangements. Financial services is by far one of the topmost heavy users of ICT. And it is consistently a target for cyber attacks. The sector is also very much interlinked, and an incident may have its own ripple effects. So back to my answer. Yes, ICT risk has increased and it has evolved. And I do not think that it will go anywhere anytime soon, because our dependency on ICT is also continuing to increase.
No, it's nice actually that you touched upon the guidelines, because this is actually where I was heading to next. On one hand, I think we have established that ICT risks and cyber risks, they have evolved and they have increased. And on the other hand, we have what I like to call the mitigation measures, or the controls that are in place in order to mitigate these increasing risks. And in a way, those are represented by the current regulatory framework that we have right now. And this is why it's nice that you touched upon the guidelines already. I just want to give a quick overview of what we have right now for the sake of clarity. So right now, in very broad terms, we have the European Supervisory Authority guidelines, as you mentioned. So we have the EBA, IOPA, and ESMA guidelines. Some guidelines, they touch upon ICT and security risk management. Some guidelines, they touch upon outsourcing, managing of outsourcing. And then some other guidelines, they touch upon the outsourcing specifically to cloud providers, for instance. So I think this is one layer. And the most comprehensive layer probably. And then on the other layer, we have the numerous directives which need to be transposed nationally, and they have been transposed differently across EU jurisdictions. And these directives, they usually are applicable just for a subset of entities within the financial services sector. And then on top of that, they set just a subset of applicable requirements. For instance, here I'm thinking specifically on Payment Services Directive 2. So we have PSD2, which is applicable just for a subset of entities. And these entities have requirements on incident reporting, for instance, which also ties into DORA, because incident reporting is also a requirement under DORA. And then on top of the directives, we have a third layer, which is the regulations. So we have something that is very similar to the directives going on here. So we have regulations applicable to a subset on a subset of requirements. And then lastly, I promise, is on the homegrown initiative. So as you said, we have our own guidance document on ICT, and other countries have their own homegrown initiatives as well. And these four layers is what our current regulatory framework in the European Union and nationally is comprised of. So I think we have, as mitigating measures, let's put it this way, something which is very comprehensive, but not necessarily easy to follow and not necessarily adequate. And at least this is what it is, in my opinion. And I'm not sure if these regulatory requirements in the framework that we have right now are able to successfully mitigate and deal with these novel and increasing risks. So I wanted to get a little bit of your opinion on that.
So, what you are mentioning was um, our initial biggest challenge when we started off the function. In an article posted by our Chief Officer Supervision and then Head of Financial Crime Compliance on the Times of Malta, this article was published last September. They wrote at the beginning of 2022, it is estimated that the European Single Rule Book for financial services was made up of approximately 700 documents ranging from directives and regulations and guidelines, which amounted to more than 15,000 pages and 23,000 articles. The provisions on ICT risk are also made up of provisions which are dispersed and also fragmented in those different documents. So yes, as it is, the current regulatory framework has a lot of problems, and this is probably one of the biggest problems that DORA aims to resolve. We have repeated this a lot of times, so you know, the fragmentation, which sometimes also goes to inconsistencies, was a problem. And of course, when you have a situation like that, it is even more difficult to cope with existent and upcoming risks and to adapt accordingly. Let's not also forget that we have financial entities which operate in more than one sector. Okay, but then there are other issues that DORA aims to resolve. So, for example, we mentioned incident reporting. At the moment, there are sectors like those operating within the payments who have an obligation to report incidents, but then there are others who do not have. And this is something that DORA aims to address. We find a lot of challenges in our policy making because, of course, we did not have enough information coming from incidents because this was not a requirement as always. Digital operation resilience testing. We had European member states implementing different approaches to that, which would then start getting inconsistent, and then it would not be recognized across jurisdiction. DORA is trying to resolve that as well. Then last but not least, of course, the area of ICT third-party risk, okay, which was not being addressed in the manner that we think it should be addressed. And now not only increased provisions on the part of financial entities, but also we have an oversight framework regulating these critical ICT third-party providers. So this, DORA attempts to resolve these challenges.
These inconsistencies and gaps. Exactly. I think an important point that I would like to make is, in a way, I think because it applies across the board, it is a little bit scary, even for us and probably for our license holders. And by the way, I just want to make an addendum, just going on the side here. It is applicable across the board, of course, to the DORA scope, but there's also a very strong element of proportionality. And there are even 3 different layers of it. This is something that we have planned for an upcoming episode. I think we as regulators, we get a lot of questions about proportionality within the regulation. And this is something that we're aiming at addressing. So it is it is applicable across the board, but there's this very important element. But going back to my point, it is applicable across the board. There are a lot of novel requirements. It is a little bit scary, even for us, believe me. But at the same time, as I said, we already had somewhat of a strong regulatory framework out there that put a lot of requirements. Yes, there were a few gaps and inconsistencies, but a lot of the requirements are already there. So I think that what DORA aims at doing specifically is gathering all of these requirements, yes, putting new ones, like introducing, for instance, ICT, third-party providers within the scope of the regulation, but at the same time, making it more cohesive. And I think this is a very important point. And also a point that I would like to make for challenges in compliance, specifically compliance costs, depending on the nature of your organization. For instance, there is the chance that you are already abiding by a lot of the requirements that are set out in the regulation, specifically, for instance, in the area of ICT risk and the ICT risk management framework and ICT governance. So I think this is something that we have to keep in mind when talking about the regulation. It's novel, it's scary in a way, but maybe it shouldn't be that much. And Alan, I wanted to get your view on another point. I wanted you to maybe summarize in just a quick summary, just a few words of what do you think the regulation sets out to do?
So let's start with the word digital operational resilience. What is this digital operational resilience? We're not going into the detail of the definition that the regulation provides. I'm going to simplify it a bit. So at a micro level, at a financial entity level, digital operational resilience is about the ability of that entity to continue providing its financial services up to the necessary level of quality and in a reliable manner, including in times of disruptions. That is what digital operation resilience in a nutshell sets to achieve. The resilience of each entity would then contribute to the overall resilience of the financial sector. And by doing that, we would be minimizing financial stability risks. Okay, so that is what we're trying to achieve at the end of the day by this. A financial service provided by a financial entity may be a product of many different parts. These parts include people, they include processes, they include different technologies. All these different parts, which can go to be very complex, need to work together reliably, both individually and collectively. A failure of one of these parts may cause a failure in the delivery of the financial service. That part may be hardware, that it may be a software, it may be a failed process, it may well be a failure on the part of an ICT third-party provider. So the regulation tries to approach this risk through its renowned 5 pillars. Okay, the first pillar being the ICT risk management framework. Okay, in a nutshell, so ICT risk management, including also governance, including also obligations on, for example, the board of directors, including processes that, for example, financial entities need to have in place in order to do proper ICT risk management. We can see a lot of principles coming from the different publications that I mentioned previously, but also principles coming from international standards. Another pillar is the ICT related incident management and reporting. So you have one aspect of the chapter dealing with how and what financial entities need to have in place to properly manage incidents, but also an obligation on financial entities to report incidents that reach certain criteria. More details on that will be published in other levels of text by the regulation. There is also a third aspect, which is on digital operation resilience testing. So there are provisions on requirements on financial entities to do testing. But then there is also part of that pillar which contemplates advanced testing which is based on threat-led penetration testing, which would typically be required on substantial organizations. Then there is the management of ICT third-party risk. Okay, it contemplates how financial entities should manage their ICT third-party risk, including provisions on key contractual provisions that they need to have in place in their contracts within their ICT third-party risk, but also now the supervision of those which are going to be designated as critical ICT third-party providers under an oversight framework by the European supervisory authorities. And last but not least, we have the fifth pillar, which is information sharing. This is on a voluntary basis, but it's still very relevant and very important, and a vehicle through which financial entities can communicate between themselves on outstanding threats and what is happening within the industry.
A point which I think it's very nice is that, for instance, we've talked a lot about risk. We've set the scene for risk. We talk about ICT risk management framework, but something that I think that DORA goes beyond is beyond just putting requirements for the assessing, identification, and risk management and risk controls. It goes beyond risk because, as you said, it introduces this aspect of digital operational resilience. So the ability of the financial entity to continuously provision their services, even in the face of some type of abruption, for instance. And this is an important point because it is not just risk. It goes beyond it. And this is why I think DORA really is going to provide value for the financial services sector in this regard. So thank you, Alan. Thank you so much for your presence here today. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to reiterate before we go off that if you have any questions, queries, something that you're curious about, or if there's any topic within the DORA regulation that you would like us to talk about in these podcasts, do not hesitate to contact us via the email address that you can see here on the screen. So, Alan, do you have any further comments?
No further comments from my end. I really hope that our financial entities find these podcasts useful. And I really also encourage that financial entities provide feedback towards these podcasts. I would also like to thank you, Beatrice, and I wish you all the very best of luck in these series of podcasts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for watching.